This video is sponsored by Incogni. Hi friends, today we're talking about everyone's favorite legion, the Word Bearers. What was that? It's a bird. It's a plane. No, it's awesome Primarch of the Raven Guard, Corvus Corax. Whoopee! Phew, I didn't know how much longer I could act like Lorgar was a stand-up guy. But yes, today we're talking about the super cool emo boys, masters of stealth, jump pack, and lightning claw aficionados, the Raven Guard. These guys are super cool and don't get the attention they deserve, which, honestly, they'd probably prefer. So, if you want stealthy, reasonable Marines who have a healthy amount of Space Marine flair, let's talk Raven Guard. The Raven Guard's claim to fame is their mastery of stealth, which it may seem a bit silly to imagine a 7-foot monster man in giant power armor tiptoeing around, but it's also terrifying to imagine a 7-foot monster man in giant power armor being able to tiptoe around and striking without warning. The Raven Guard learned how to be masters of stealth and guerrilla warfare from their Primarch Corvus Corax. Young Corax crash landed on the prison moon of Kievar, called Lycaeus, and he was discovered by a girl named Natsuri. She and the slaves believed the strange boy to be special, so they hid the young Primarch from the tyrannical Kievarian overlords. Also, the prisoners of Lycaeus weren't necessarily some heinous criminals, as most were actually arrested for opposing the rule of the tyrannical and cruel Kievarian overlords. The slaves believed Corax to be their savior and named him the Deliverer, which is coincidentally the same thing I call my Amazon guy. As a child, Corax was taught leadership as well as the arts of urban warfare, close combat fighting, demolition, and stealth. And being a magic space baby, he learned fast and mastered everything needed to eventually stage an uprising. To prepare for an eventual revolt, Corax and his slaves gathered weapons and supplies, coordinated their forces, and trained. Corax launched a number of precision strikes and strategic raids to destabilize the planet, and then he launched ambushes on the disoriented Lycaeus defense force. He continued his guerrilla campaign against the Kievarian overlords, masterfully striking from the shadows, and he finally defeated his oppressors using a combination of stealth, cunning, and these 5 nuclear bombs that he found, definitively proving that the ultimate stealth technique is huge explosions. But joking aside, he did cleverly use his learned skills to get these nuclear bombs and, more importantly, get them to detonate in key locations. So he's not really a dumb boom Primarch like half of his brothers. But thanks to Corax, the tyrannical tech guilds collapsed and millions rejoiced with their newfound freedom. Afterwards, the moon was renamed Deliverance to honor Corax, and as they were celebrating their freedom from their oppressive rulers, the Emperor of Mankind arrived to meet Corax. And now, for no reason at all, here's a dictionary definition of irony. But before getting any further, do you wish that you could stealthily hide your personal information on that spooky place, the internet? Well, if so, Incogni would be perfect for you. Incogni very helpfully removes your personal information from data broker sites. Data broker sites can be quite dangerous. Malicious ones may weaponize your personal information to carry out scary things like scams, identity theft, and those gosh darn scam likely calls. Creepily, there can be hundreds of sites that have your information. There were a scary amount of sites with a lot of my personal information easily available just for my name. But now, after using Incogni for a while, they've taken my data off over 400 sites, and I really have to dig deep to find any with my information, which is very nice. Best of all though, I basically had to do nothing to get this taken down. Once given permission from you, Incogni goes out and does everything needed to remove your personal information from these gosh darn data brokers. It saves a lot of time as you don't have to deal with the annoyance of data broker websites intentionally making a long, arduous process to get your information taken down. Also, if you come across a site before Incogni gets to it, you can use their new custom removal feature to send a custom request for them to take care of it. So, if you're interested, click the link in the description, incogni.com/crackduck, and use the promo code CRACKDUCK to get a 60% off on the annual plan. Thank you, Incogni, for sponsoring this video. But anyways, Corax was convinced of the Emperor's cause as the Emperor promised to help liberate Kievar. With the Emperor's help, Corax and the boys liberated Kievar, and it was converted to a Mechanicus Forge world and continues to supply the Raven Guard to this day. And Corax was highly loyal to the Emperor and respected his father. Which, having hindsight of the Emperor's actions and the Imperium, you might think that Mr. Corvus I hate tyranny Corax was a bit hypocritical. But the Emperor is a very convincing guy. Unironically, the Emperor's magic aura intact won Corvus over as he presented himself as humanity's only salvation. Plus, Corax truly deeply believed that he bore witness to the Emperor's truest self and that the Emperor was not a tyrant, as his conquest and cruelty were not to win power, but were rather a necessary and coldly logical step in ensuring humanity's survival. Corax didn't fully agree with the Emperor's actions, but he did trust that they would culminate in the survival of mankind, and when the long night was over, he could work to better people's lives. Plus, not even he could foresee the mess that the Imperium would eventually devolve into. Anyways though, reunited with his legion, Corax deeply loved and cared for his sons and taught them the arts of stealth as well as his core values. Originally, the 19th were cold and cruel oppressors, but Corax quickly reprimanded this behavior as he despised oppressors and tyrants. So, Corax taught his legion to be liberators and beacons of hope to the oppressed and hapless. Along with this, he invented the Rites of Shadow and later the Trifold Path after this Dropsite massacre, both of which were meant to guide his sons to be the warriors he wanted them to be. The Rites of Shadow is essentially a ritual to test a Marine's conviction and character. It is completely silent to maintain secrecy, as it is performed using the Raven Guard sign language of Corspeak. And this ritual is still done in the present setting, and those who pass are given the honorary title of Shadow added to their rank, i.e. Shadow Captain or Shadow Sergeant. And then, the Trifold Path are the three tenets of victory that Corax taught his sons. These reflect the Raven Guard's fighting style and were deeply important to the Legion in later chapter. The three pillars of the path are ambush, stealth, and vigilance. Corax taught that mastery of one path made victory possible, mastery of two makes victory likely, and mastery of all three makes victory inevitable. And in the current setting, the Raven Guard 3rd, 4th, and 5th Company are dedicated to one of the three principles, and once their respective skill is mastered, a Marine is able to be promoted to a new company to master the next. Most Raven Guard are masters of at least one, but few are truly masters of all three like their father before them. Also, fun fact, the Trifold Path was made by Corax to help with his son's depression. You see, Raven Guard have a genetic default that causes something called the Sable Brand in some Marines. This is basically a super depression where the Marine is temporarily haunted by the voice of the dead, gets depressed and nihilistic, and then goes a bit insane. This leads to the afflicted Marines fighting with little self-preservation, and they just kick ass until there's no more ass left to kick, or they die. So yeah, basically it's a murder depression. Anyways though, the Raven Guard were known for being an efficient and uncompromising legion. They quickly liberated planets and then put them under Imperial rule. Also, straight up, of all the legions, the Raven Guard tactics make the most sense for the Space Marines. It simply doesn't really make sense for a resource-intensive super soldier with a very limited population to be engaging in giant open field clashes, perfectly open to artillery strikes, orbital barrages, or just good old mass firepower. But even though it doesn't make sense, it's perfectly fine since big old battles are super cool and more fun for a game. But just putting on the boring hat, logically speaking, it doesn't really make sense for Space Marines to do the job of a guardsman. The Raven Guard, on the other hand, though, they operate in a way that's probably much more realistic for a fighting force like the Space Marines. The Raven Guard are masters of guerrilla warfare, and they tend to work in relatively small fighting forces called Talons. Each Talon performs a series of operations meant to destabilize, demoralize, weaken, and otherwise bleed their foes. Then, once their enemy is sufficiently weakened, the Talons reconsolidate for a final, overwhelming assault to crush their enemy. As such, they often utilize jump pack assaults, precision drop pod attacks, assassinations, and scout ambushes targeting key locations, commanders, and objectives. The former are especially cool as I'm a huge fan of jump packs and lightning claws. These are nicely on point for their bird theme, as well as being totally badass. In addition, they field an unusually small number of tanks and other vehicles. They generally prefer lighter and more agile armor and vehicles. Notably, however, they do make surprisingly good use of the famously heavy Terminator armor. Thanks to its deep strike teleportation abilities, Terminator armor is actually perfect for rapid and powerful ambush assaults against the toughest of foes. But anyways, looping back to 30k, despite their efficiency in the Great Crusade, tragedy would find them like the hide-and-seek world champion at an amateur slumber party. Their first massive loss was under the command of War Master Horus Lupercal at the Occam Sothos cluster. Horus commanded the Raven Guard to perform a giant frontal assault against the deadly gate, which it's obviously a stupid idea to send your stealth units to the front lines, especially when you have the melee monster Space Wolves and Siege Master Iron Warriors with you. However, Corax was the newest Primarch to be found at this time, so it was very likely a power move. Anyways though, Corax of course protested and argued for a more subtle approach, as he would, but eventually he submitted to Horus's authority. And the Raven Guard, of course, took huge casualties. The battle would leave them as the smallest legion and would cause a lifelong resentment towards Horax. Horax, what the fuck? What is that, like a slutty Corax? Anyways, though, it would cause a lifelong resentment towards Horus in Corax. However, the silver lining of this was that Corax begrudgingly sent most of his more cruel Terran sons to be killed. So, with that and the great losses tying them together, the Raven Guard was more unified than ever. However, these losses would pale, no pun intended, in comparison to the next tragedy that would befall the poor old Bird Boys. After Horus revealed his heresy at Istvan III, the Raven Guard were part of the retaliation force sent to intercept the Arc Trader on Istvan V. Nearly all of the Raven Guard Legion assembled to quell the heresy, and Corax led 80,000 of his sons to fight along 7 of his other brother legions. But it was all a ruse, and 4 out of the 8 legions sent revealed themselves traitor, and the Imperial Fists were unable to make it to the planet. So, the overwhelming Loyalist forces were hit with the Una reverse card as the Raven Guard, Iron Hands, and Salamanders were now hopelessly outnumbered and surrounded in the Urgal Depression. Despite the heroic efforts of the Loyalists, the initial ambush of the secret traitors, and the combined efforts of 7 whole traitor legions led to the near annihilation of the 3 Loyalist legions. Ferrus Manus was killed by Fulgrim, Vulcan was nuked, and their legions were decimated. Actually, even more than decimated. Corax tried evacuating his sons, but he was thwarted. So he did the next best thing and went Insano style, killing all the traitors who stood against him and his legion. Eventually he killed his way towards that bastard Lorgar, and he thoroughly effed him up. Unfortunately though, rival emo Conrad Kurz intervened before Corax could kill Lorgar, forcing Corax to retreat. Then, for 80 more grueling days, Corax led his remnant forces in a guerrilla campaign to kill as many traitors as possible and protect their fallen brother's honor as well as survive. And when all hope seemed lost, the Raven Guard who were left to protect Deliverance arrived to rescue their Primarch and remaining brothers. Of the 80,000 Marines, only about 3,000 survived. With this grand betrayal, Corax swore vengeance, but he also lamented to the Emperor in a magic space vision call that he was a failure both to his legion and to the Imperium. Bloodied from Istvan, Corax begged the Emperor to give his blessing to allow Corax and his sons to sacrifice all they had left to kill as many traitors as possible. The Emperor admired Corax's sacrifice and conviction, so he showed Corax his secret gene labs. He entrusted Corax with the tools, knowledge, and permission to improve upon the Space Marine creation process so that he would be able to rapidly rebuild his legion. Which, honestly, is pretty huge as the Emperor isn't often the trusting type, so it shows that he had a great deal of respect and trust in Corax. And the madman actually did it. He made Space Marines who were stronger, faster developing, and easier to implant gene seed in, able to make Marines from far younger aspirants like literal 5-year-olds or adults, since the implantation success rates were way higher. With these innovations, Corax was able to make 500 new Marines in a few weeks, which is insane. But, unfortunately, those bastards, the Alpha Legion, had to show up and ruin everything. The Alpha Legion, using literal face masks and their signature deception, infiltrated the infiltrators and sabotaged Corax's project with an evil-ass demon virus. This caused the new Marines to mutate horribly and also almost destroyed the Raven Guard gene seed entirely, but Corax was able to stop them in the nick of time. This attack, however, left the Raven Guard gene seed permanently damaged, and they now lack Mucranoid and Belcher glands, and their melochromatic organs are also defective. This means that they're a little less resilient than other Marines, can't spit acid, and are able to star in Tim Burton movies. Anyways, though, from all the tragedies that he faced, Korax would have an existential crisis when he went to save the Space Wolves on Uranus. Seeing Lehman Russ gravely wounded from his battle with Horus, Korax would lament his own creation, feeling that he and his brothers were never meant to be. And after dramatically monologuing, he would attempt a suicidal last stand with his sons and Bjorn the Fell-Handed's remaining forces in order to redeem his self-proclaimed failed existence. But seeing the arrogant sons of Horus reminded Korax that Horus is asshole and Korax hate. So, due to Horus being a bastard man, Korax realized that he could redeem himself much better by killing a shitload of traitors instead of himself. So, he did a little tactical retreat to regroup his legion, and he led his shadow campaign for the rest of the heresy, striking traitor forces from the shadows and leveraging his dwindling numbers to the best. And then, after the heresy, Korax would mercy kill his mutated sons as they were constantly in pain and insane. He was once again in despair from having to kill his own sons, as well as all the horrible shit that happened in the last 8 years. So he exiled himself to the tallest tower of the Ravenspire, the Eyrie for a Yuri. And after a year of seeking the Emperor's mercy, he left the tower and went into the Eye of Terror to earn his redemption. And now, he stalks the warp as a being of literal shadow and darkness. He became in tune with his true nature, mastering his Primarch power of shadows, and took his race-slipping ability and name to the max as he can literally become a shadow or a murderer of demonic ravens. Notably, he terrorized the Wordbearer's demon world and beat the shit out of Lorgar for a second time, vowing to eventually kill the Primarch once and for all. As for the rest of his legion post-heresy, Korax felt Gilliman was right, and the Raven Guard followed the Codex Astartes to a high level, only second to the Ultramarines. And in the current timeline, the Raven Guard continues to conduct shadow operations to dismantle and destroy their foes, liberating planets from the Heretic and Xenos menace. Also, fun fact, while speaking about liberating planets, they have something called the Moritat Protocol, where a lone Marine is sent to a war zone or something to liberate the population. Originally, the Mortats were Marines with the Sable brand, and since they had murder depression, Korax gave them a jetpack and some guns and let them go nuts. However, some would go down, train the local population in combat, then go nuts, essentially making them a badass super soldier version of those crazy Liberator pistols. But anyways, the Raven Guard are also notable for being extremely cautious in battle, as they cannot afford to waste their scarce gene seed with the needless deaths of their brothers. As such, in addition to their generally smarter and more tactical approach to battle, the Raven Guard are also extremely strict with their aspirant. The Raven Guard go through great lengths to preserve their gene seed and have some special protocols in place to help with that. For example, they have an abnormally high amount of apothecaries to ensure that when a Marine is killed, as much gene seed as possible is saved, and also, new recruits are held to an extremely high scrutiny in order to ensure only the very best receive Korax's degraded gene seed. This means that the Raven Guard aspirant trials are among the most dangerous, and the ones who are able to ascend to Marines are generally more elite than their cousin chapters, at least at first. In addition, their training as a Marine is extremely thorough, and the Marines are held to a high scrutiny. For example, Raven Guard scouts might serve in the 10th Company for up to a decade, as opposed to the few months that other chapter scouts serve. They also work closely with full-fledged Marines to ensure the best training. But this makes sense, as scouts tend to employ tactics that align with the Raven Guard combat doctrines of stealth, ambush, and vigilance. Plus, it's easier to be stealthy in a scout uniform versus the power armor that requires skill and knowledge to move stealthily in. Expanding on that though, skilled Raven Guard Marines know their armor and gear so intimately that they can time their armor's noises to their environment, blending into backgrounds and moving in silence. Some especially skilled and talented Marines can even emulate their father's ability to race slip and become almost completely invisible. The ability to race slip isn't actually a magical power, rather it's an ability born of extreme skill, awareness, and knowledge. Masters of this skill are able to move so stealthily that they're practically invisible. Which again, for an 8-foot monster man, being able to move like this is horrifying. But looping back to their aspirants, they draw recruits from their homeworld of Deliverance and its planet of Kievar. In addition, the Raven Guard Marines live up to Korax's ideals of uplifting humanity, and they're known to actually interact with the people of their homeworlds, and they have close ties unlike most chapters. This includes training the PDF, helping to organize defenses, and training people in their shadow tactics. This also serves a dual purpose as, along with building rapport, they strengthen the world's defenses and prime the people for recruitment. Finally, though, for their warfare and war gear, the Raven Guard famously prefer to wear the Mark VI Corvus armor. It's even named after their Primarch since the 19th Legion tested it out in the Great Crusade. The armor had lighter protection, but featured quieter servos, better sensors, and was overall more agile. It also had an appropriately bird-like beaked helmet. And in the modern era, the Primaris Raven Guard prefers the lighter Phobos variant of the Mark X Tacticus armor. Oh, and kinda random, but they also live in a haunted mansion, and that's only somewhat of a joke. Their fortress monastery, the Ravenspire, is full of cobwebs, spooky corridors, and is theorized to be possessed by something. Be it ghosts of the fallen ravens or an ancient machine spirit, there definitely is something roaming the halls, opening doors, moving stuff, and the cries of the fallen can be heard periodically echoing throughout the fortress. And finally, their chapter master is the legendary Ultra Chad Kayvaan Shrike. Woo! Former chapter master. He has since given up his title to Shadow Captain Athon Shan so that he can focus more on what he does best, being super hella cool and killing shit, rather than managing a chapter. Which is honestly kinda based, and Shan looks super cool. But anyways, this section was brief because I want to make a dedicated video on Shrike since I really like him. His models are super cool and some of my favorites. His Primaris version might just be my favorite Primaris model of all time. But that's the Raven Guard, and I really like them. My homebrew chapter's even a Raven Guard successor. But I love that they're a relatively smart and reasonable chapter, but they also aren't above doing a badass lightning claw jump pack assault from time to time. Plus, I also really like their spooky and emo aesthetic, and Korax and his son's depressed nature in contrast to their determination to destroy tyrants and better humanity is actually pretty inspiring and wholesome. As long as you overlook the fact that they free planets of tyrants and then put them under imperial rule. I personally like to imagine that they just feel super happy about liberating a planet, and then the Imperium immediately does their evil-ass evilisms after the Raven Guard leave, and the Bird Boys are just unaware. But yeah, super cool, underrated chapter. Let me know what you think of the Raven Guard in the comments below. You already know I like them, and Korax is probably one of my top Primarchs, but I'd love to see what you have to say. And again, big thanks to Incogni for sponsoring this video. Be sure to click the link in the description, incogni.com/crackduck, and use promo code crackduck to get 60% off on the annual plan. But anyways, thank you for watching, and big thanks to the patrons who support the channel. You're all very epic. And as always, please like, comment, subscribe, and consider sharing to all your sad emo bird boys. Thanks. Corvus Corax would be so confused seeing the Gene Stealer cults, other than their little quirk of getting eaten and working for